I'm sorry, what? Oh. See anybody there? Need one more minute. Heidi, is there anybody else in the outside, or we're good, right? Huh. Okay. I think we're good. All right. Hello, everybody. And everybody in Zoom land on this pre-election Monday night. So I want to thank everybody coming to our fall speaker series. Tonight, George Savarese is going to speak about Russia's disaster in Ukraine. I'm sure everybody knows George, so I'm going to keep the introduction very brief, since he has spoken to us many times, and he is taught most of our kids at some point or another, including mine. And if your kids are not involved in Model UN, I strongly suggest they join. Because we've got like the best Model UN team under George, like anywhere. We've won the Model UN has won more trophies than the football team. Their trophy case is bigger, right? Your trophy case is bigger.
It's a little more dense.
Yeah. So, George has been, I worked in radio, including NPR, CBS, Voice of America, one of my favorite radio stations. I listened to it when I was in college. And he was the education and director for the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. And again, great leader for Model UN. I do want to thank the Adult Education Committee and also Adele and Warren Suffern for sponsoring tonight. There's Warren. Would you stand up, Warren, and take a bow? And I have exciting news in the world of technology at Bethel. You can now go to the Bethel YouTube channel and watch any of our lectures, including past lectures, right? Including past lectures. So now you don't have to worry about calling me and asking me how to find them, because they're available now. And we have two more speakers in our fall speaker series. Todd DePastino will be speaking on Mount Lebanon Goes to War during World War II. Really, actually very interesting subject, because we started as a very pacifist neighborhood and turned out to be a very not so pacifist neighborhood, I guess a good way of putting it. And then we're having my mother-in-law, Irene Skolnick, come and speak. And she's spoken before about her experience. Her family hid out during World War II as Catholics in Poland and right by the Majdanek concentration camp. And she's going to be talking a little bit about the boss her father worked for, who owned a factory basically making bullion cubes for the German military. And her father was dealing on a day-to-day basis with the German military. And the owner of the factory knew that my mother-in-law's father was Jewish and never revealed him. And he's a righteous Gentile in Israel, or he was named the righteous Gentile in Israel. So that will be the next 2 Mondays. And then we're taking a break for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And then we'll come back with our winter speaker series. So I've said all I can say. So with that, come on up, George.
Thanks, Neil. Thank you. Appreciate it. Well, as soon as Neil announced that all the programs are available on YouTube, I expected a mass exodus to just leave and then to call in tomorrow and see if you could just bring it up and enjoy the night. But I'm glad to see so many friends and so many familiar faces. Every time that I receive a phone call from Rabbi Alex or from Neil. I always worry that I've done something bad with one of their children and perhaps they're in trouble. But instead, they asked me to return and to speak to my friends here at Bethel. So thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure. It's incredible that when we talk about these subjects, you just happen to see something in the news the night that you're speaking. And for me, it was online, the New York Times today, with the headline, "Russia reactivates its trolls and bots ahead of Tuesday's midterms." Researchers have identified a series of Russian information operations, misinformation actually, to influence American elections and erode support for Ukraine. And it's a fascinating article that came out today all about how, taking the lessons of 2016, now the lessons are, if the Republican majority in the House and Senate, including people who are speaking about why is the United States supporting Ukraine, why is the United States giving aid or weapons to Ukraine, the Russians believe that that support can be eroded. And perhaps if they're able to influence these elections, if they're able to get on social media and create these fake accounts and false media accounts on social media, that perhaps they can actually interfere with tomorrow's midterm elections and erode support, which thus far has been bipartisan, in Congress for the U.S. helping Ukraine. For example, over the weekend, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she's certainly going to be nominated for a, I'm sure, post in the Congress. She should be in charge of the Mensa Society because she's obviously such a brilliant, brilliant mind. She spoke at a Donald Trump rally in Iowa over the weekend, where she got applause from the audience when she said not another dime should be spent on Ukraine. Not another dime should go from the United States to helping Ukraine, when we should complete the wall on the border, because that's the greatest threat to American security. And shortly thereafter, Liz Cheney, soon to be former representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, tweeted out, and I have to give this to you. She put on the tweet for the video clip of Marjorie Taylor Greene. Liz Cheney wrote, "This is exactly what Vladimir Putin wants. If we would have had Republicans like this in the 80s, we would have lost the Cold War." That's from Liz Cheney. It goes on, the New York Times piece, to talk about in 2016, in St. Petersburg, the Russian former KGB, the FSB, had a gigantic building that we actually pinpointed called the IRA. When most of us hear the IRA, we think of some individual retirement account or the Irish Republican Army. But this is the Internet Research Agency based in St. Petersburg. And it's a factory of hackers and trolls to basically fight cyber warfare against us. In St. Petersburg, this internet operation has been quiet the last year, but hasn't been quiet since the fall, since early September. What are they doing? Well, here we go. A woman who identified as Nora Burka resurfaced after a year of silence on social media, posting messages with sharply conservative political themes, talking about how Biden and other prominent Democrats, and sometimes would actually use obscenities and different things like this, lamenting taxpayer dollar support for Ukraine in its war against invading Russian forces. And this same Nora Burka was arguing that the United States should not be using these taxpayer dollars in support of Ukraine when we have so many issues here at home, when inflation is so high at home. And here's the thing, there's no person named Nora Burka. They traced it back to a Russian troll who in 2016 was putting out information in the 2016 election to favor Donald Trump. And the messages continued about cut off aid and money to Ukraine and went on to target Democratic candidates where? Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona, and Georgia. Because the belief is if there is a strong Republican majority in the Senate and House, it could help the Russian effort by cutting off aid to Ukraine. I don't believe that that's necessarily true. Mitch McConnell went to Kiev. I'm sorry, I can't call it Kyiv. I know that the Ukrainians call it Kyiv, but I've had chicken Kiev all my life. So forgive me for my mispronunciation. But Mitch McConnell went to the Ukrainian capital and said, this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is bipartisan U.S. support, along with our NATO allies, for Russia attempting to invade, basically take over Ukraine. They wanted to replace Zelensky, the president, with a Russian puppet. The goal was not only take territory, but take over power by putting a puppet into play, a leader who would do whatever Putin asked. And they thought that there would be no reaction or response from the United States or from NATO. Look at 2014 when they took Crimea. There was very little European response. There was very little American response. Germany, France, Italy, they continued to buy Russian oil and gas. The Germans continued with their pipeline projects. But something misfired after February 4th. Folks, 8 months ago, Vladimir Putin thought this was going to be easy. He thought it would bring Russia even more power, territory. And he miscalculated absolutely 100% of the way. He never thought that the Europeans would actually become more united, that he would lose Germany as a partner and a customer of Russian oil and gas, because guess what the Germans did? They canceled the pipeline contracts. Guess what the Europeans are doing right now? They're figuring out how to cope this winter without Russian oil and gas. And if they're able to figure out how to avoid being reliant on Russia for oil and gas, my friends, that is a death blow to Russia's economy. Because without the European countries buying, without the United States buying anything, we only got about 3% of our imported oil from Russia. So it's not any kind of a hit to us. But without the European countries dependent on Russian oil and gas, where does Putin go? China? India? The British, the French, the Italians, the Germans, the Dutch, they all were dependent on Russian oil and gas. In France, Macron came out and said, we're not wearing suits and ties this winter. We're wearing turtleneck sweaters, and encouraged the French to turn down their thermostats and wear more sweaters inside. And let's all pitch in together for this effort to not allow the Russians to break us. We haven't heard unity like this from Europe since the Cold War. We haven't seen unity like this between Europe and the United States since the Cold War. And Vladimir Putin saying that he's going to break Ukraine and now deciding to bomb the cities to do what? To eliminate their water supply, to destroy their electricity? What is the purpose of that? Why is he doing that? Is it military that he's targeting? No. He's hitting civilians and trying to destroy their reservoirs, their water supply, their electrical grid. So the Ukrainians freeze, and this winter have no water or electricity. What are the Ukrainians doing? They're begging us and the Europeans for generators. And we are going to send from Europe and the USA 100,000 generators to Ukraine. It's also making the Ukrainians' resolve even stronger. because here are the Russians under Putin trying to snap them into two, break them into pieces. And my friends, think about how you forget all of your domestic problems if you are faced with a country that is pushing you and trying to actually question and destroy your very existence. How many times did Israel unite? And all of you know, as a good friend of mine, a former shaliach here in Pittsburgh said, Israel is a wonderful country of 16 million prime ministers. He said, everybody you talk to has their own ideas of what it takes for that country to be great. And he said, this is the thing, though. What does it take to unite us? When we are threatened, when we are attacked, when someone thinks that somehow they can inflict pain and suffering upon us, we come together. And that's the lesson we're seeing in Ukraine. That's the lesson we're seeing with European and American support. The New York Times article of today goes on to say, these campaigns show several things. One, how desperate the Russians are, that they've taken to cyber attacks again on the US. Two, how vulnerable we are, that once again, these Russian attacks have made their way through. And the FBI issued an alert last week, warning about the quote unquote dark web media channels, messaging apps, spoofed websites, emails, and fake online personas. The Russians think this is a wonderful opportunity to interfere in our midterm elections. Let me just end with one of these ads targeted Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, who is Black, by employing racial slurs. Another falsely claimed that Representative Tim Ryan of Youngstown, Ohio, who is running for senator in Ohio against J.D. Vance. It said, if you vote for Tim Ryan in Ohio, he will release all fentanyl distributors and drug traffickers from prison. Nora Burka, remember that name? She posted a photograph that showed Ukrainian President Zelensky as a bikini-wearing pole dancer being showered with dollar bills by President Biden. And the account posted, as working-class Americans struggle to afford food, gas, and baby formula, Joe Biden wants to spend billions in aid to Ukraine. The same message that was picked up by Marjorie Taylor Greene in her rally in Iowa last weekend. Vladimir Putin is offering a master class in how not to fight a war. That's from the Washington Post editorial of 3 weeks ago. His reckless nuclear threats have failed to stop support from the United States and Europe. And his newly called up since September 21st, 300,000 Russians who were drafted. The Washington Post says, untrained recruits, 300,000 of them, might as well report straight to the morgue. And now the bombing campaign to bomb Ukrainian cities, to terrorize the people, to get them to buckle when they don't have electricity and water this winter, is actually backfiring again. It's only strengthening their resolve. And it's starting to show the cracks inside Russia. Because when Putin had to say, we need 300,000 new soldiers, why do they need 300,000 more soldiers? Because they've been losing and they're desperate on the ground. They're losing territory. They're losing battles. And the American and European weapons that have been put in the hands of the Ukrainians have destroyed the Russian army, destroying the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, And suddenly these Russian tanks and trucks and missile launchers that were supposed to be so superior have been made into junk. The CIA estimates that over 100,000 Russians are dead. And suddenly, after Putin declared 4 states on the border between Ukraine and Russia suddenly belonged to Russia, the Russian army couldn't hold those 4 states as the Ukrainians pushed and took back territory. And now what you're seeing is the Russians basically admitting we can't stop the Ukrainians. We can't win the war on the ground. So we're going to rely on missiles being sent from faraway lands in Russia to hit the Ukrainian cities. 300,000 Russians were drafted. Here's a question for everyone here tonight. Where did they come from? Where in Russia? They're coming from Chechnya. They're coming from Siberia. They're coming from the south and the east. Many of them are Muslim. Because Putin, when he announced the draft of 300,000, didn't simultaneously announce that he was shutting off the border so people couldn't get out. And what did the Russians do? They fled to Finland, to Kazakhstan, to Georgia. They got out. And suddenly, in embarrassing fashion, what did the Russians have to do? Close off the borders to prevent more from escaping to those other countries. Had to suddenly say anyone trying to leave the country will be arrested and imprisoned. And Putin went on television and said these things. It is a crime to oppose the war. Any protesters will face torture and imprisonment. This is a necessary self-cleansing of our society of the scum who do not support the true patriots. And then the kicker. This is for peace. This is for victory. And this is for our country without Nazis. What? He said in the summer that Ukraine was being invaded by the Russians because the Nazis were leading Ukraine's government. That evening, President Zelensky of Ukraine came on and said, I'm Jewish. How am I a Nazi? How is my government suddenly the Nazis here in Ukraine? It's so utterly ridiculous. But once again, folks, every message we've gotten from Russia since this war began has been something from the theater of the absurd. Every time that the Russians have said, watch out, look at what the Ukrainians are doing, it actually was something they were doing. They were accusing the Ukrainians of war crimes when the German intelligence people were picking up phone calls on cell phones. They were intercepting Russian phone calls because the Russians weren't using secure walkie-talkies. They were on cell phones. And the Russian soldiers were talking about rape, torture, executing bodies but not having the time to bury them, leaving them on the streets. The International Criminal Court at The Hague has said war crimes have been committed. Charges will be filed for crimes against humanity. And still the Russians keep saying, no, it's the Ukrainians shooting their own people, bombing their own towns and villages. And now what makes me nervous, my friends, and I have lots of people who say, George, how do you study this? How do you sleep at night? And I say, I sleep like a baby. I wake up every 2 hours crying. Because now the Russians have started to say, watch out, the Ukrainians are going to use a dirty bomb in the war against us. Okay, let's take a moment and explain what a dirty bomb is. It's a cheap nuclear device. It's taking nuclear ingredients, uranium, plutonium, and not using the Enrico Fermi, Robert Oppenheimer, brilliant laws of physics that put together a hydrogen bomb or a nuclear device. It's taking some nuclear ingredients and just putting them into a bomb. So when the bomb explodes, you just have radiation. You don't have a nuclear blast. It's not a nuclear bomb. It's a dirty as in radioactive bomb. And now the Russians are saying, we're nervous that the Ukrainians are going to use a dirty bomb. Well, what does that have me staying up at night thinking the Russians are going to do? Planning to use a dirty bomb. Except, and this is the best thing about teaching at Mount Lebanon, there are many wonderful things. The best thing is my students. And the fact that years later, I'm still in contact with many of them. I still will have lunch or coffee every time there's a holiday. My wife says, you don't go on holiday, you go on a schmoozing trip with all of your former students. I say, yes, I do. And some of those former students are at the State Department, a few are at the CIA. And I love talking to them because they tell me things off the record. And one of them was last summer from a former student who's at the CIA. And he said, look, we've made it very clear to the Russians. We've made it very clear. If they even think about using any type of what they call tactical or small nuclear weapon or radioactive bomb, that we and the NATO countries together will absolutely wipe them out. Conventional warfare. We will wipe out every Russian tank that's out there. We will take out every single Russian ship in the Black Sea. We've made it very clear to them, if you think about using a nuclear weapon or a radioactive bomb in this situation, you will pay dearly, and you will be kicked out of the Security Council of the United Nations, where Russia has been since the end of World War II and always in a position to veto anything the US or the UN was going to put out there they didn't like. And so when people say, do you really think the Russians would use a nuclear weapon? I tell audiences they'll think about it. And Putin might be so desperate as to even explore if it's a possibility. And so when I start looking at articles from intelligence people sent to me, senior Russian military leaders reportedly discussed using tactical nukes as losses in Ukraine mount. My former student at the CIA said, oh, absolutely, they're talking about it. Oh, absolutely, they've been thinking about whether they can pull it off to scare the Ukrainians, to scare the Europeans, to even frighten the Americans. And he said, but see, we don't want to make public the threats we give Moscow. Because for years, they've threatened that they could shut off all the lights on the Eastern Seaboard, and they can. We have that vulnerability. But why don't they? Because we've made it very clear that if the lights go out on the Eastern Seaboard, you will be working in the dark in Moscow and St. Petersburg for the next 6 weeks. And we have the capability of doing that. And the Russians know we do. Because this is another thing this war has exposed. Technologically, they're miles behind the United States, hundreds and thousands of miles behind us. Their weapons are no match. When we send the Ukrainians, and we haven't sent them our best stuff, but when we send the Ukrainians, suddenly anti-missiles, anti-tank weapons, the Ukrainians look at us like, oh my God, this is incredible. When we sent drones that were able to basically bring down Russian helicopters, planes, tanks, the Russians didn't know what to do. The Ukrainians started, with also this help from the CIA, started to take out bridges that were connecting Russia and Ukraine. The supply line got cut off. And now the Russians are so desperate because they've used up so much of their weapons. Folks, the cupboard is bare. Who are they buying these kamikaze drones from right now? There's these things called kamikaze drones, which basically are like the size of, I don't know, this wonderful microphone I have in front of me that's a bit intimidating. But they're sending these kamikaze drones, which fly like any kind of a drone, but their intent is to just hit and blow up a target. They have bought 450 of these, and they just ordered another 1,000. Again, I ask you, my friends, from what country? Iran. Do you notice they're not buying from China? As Putin talked about his good friend Xi and the support he was going to get from the Chinese have looked at this situation and said, this is not worth our time or our trouble. And this simply cements the fact that the Russians are our junior partners in the world. They are not at our level. And we don't want to be weighed down by a Russian nuisance in Ukraine. And so Putin is buying from Iran. And ladies and gentlemen, Israel, which has been neutral in this entire war, Israel is now starting to say we have to examine our neutrality based on what Iran is doing with Russia. Vladdy, you did it again. You turned Finland and Sweden into NATO members who had been neutral forever. And now Israel, which was being very cautious and careful, and I don't blame them, and neutral, because the Russians were always in Syria. And with the Russians in Syria, Israel was nervous that if they bombed Iranian outposts in Syria, the Russians might retaliate, and they didn't want to see this escalate. But now, guess what? We don't have too many Russians in Syria anymore. They all got pulled out and brought over to the war in Ukraine. And now Iran is selling to the Russians. And some reports are that Iran is expecting something in return from the Russians. Help with their nuclear weapons program. And if the Russians make the mistake of owing Iran some of their scientists to help with their nuclear weapons program, suddenly you've brought Israel into this, because Israel has said every minute of the last 10, 15 years, we will not allow Iran to have nuclear weapons. Especially when Iran says their goal is to what? Wipe Israel off of the map. So, and this is not Netanyahu or former prime ministers. This is Israel has stayed neutral, but kept a very close watch on what was happening with Iran, and now Iran-Russia partnership. By the way, guess what? Iran says, we're not selling anything to Russia. Those drones don't come from Iran. And people are looking at them going, we have actual captured drones that didn't go off. You make them. They're yours. No, they're knockoffs. Somebody else is making them and selling them to the Russian. And my feeling is, who's knocking off Iranian drones and selling them to the Russians? What are the Vietnamese staying up late at night making these copycat drones when they could be making copycat Nikes and making a fortune? Come on. This is absolutely ridiculous. Putin's desperation, my friends, is showing. And by the way, have any of you seen Vladimir Putin lately? My guess is he's in the middle stages of Parkinson's disease. Watch him shake. Watch him grab the podium. Watch his leg as he's sitting down, continually throb and shake. Have you noticed Vladimir Putin's face looks much more swollen? And we, of course, being long-suffering Pittsburgh Pirate fans, remember what happened to Barry Bonds when he went to the San Francisco Giants. Vladimir Putin looks swollen. Do you know why? He's getting treatments, steroid treatments, and the steroids cause the swelling. Ask Barry Bonds, who, by the way, is up for the Hall of Fame this year. Let's hope the baseball people have a shred of integrity and he never gets in. But that's just another issue. By the way, Vladimir Putin also, recent picture of him speaking to the crowd. He made a mistake of gesturing with his hand, and his hand was black. Well, why is his hand black? From the IVs, from the needles. Everywhere he goes now, he's traveling with a medical team. He's getting daily injections of steroids, IV, through the hand. He's puffing up. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. Anyone who denies the existence of God, let's look at Vladimir Putin quickly go away because of health issues. But that leads us to another question. What if Vladimir Putin does? Because of health, or he's overturned? What happens if he does go away? I think it's going to be a long road before that happens. But who would replace Vladimir Putin? Probably somebody from his inner circle, from the Russian military, maybe even somebody who is from the hard right, even further right than Putin, though that's hard to imagine these days. Because Putin has declared martial law. And because the ethnic Russian population, I'm coming back to this, continues to decline in Russia. Let me just add a quick pop quiz, if you don't mind. What's the population of the United States? 330 million people. 330 million is the US population. Todd DiPastino or Pete DiNardo won't give you a pop quiz, but I will. 330 million people. What's the population of Russia? It's 145 million, less than half. How is a country that enormous with 11 time zones, 11, only have 145 million people? Their life expectancy is about, for the Russian male, 63. They suffer. And Vladimir Putin is fighting two wars, one in Ukraine and one against his own people in Russia, because he's choking off their economy. He's suppressing and putting martial law in Russia. And he keeps talking about, we need to have more children in Russia. Our birth rate is too low. And the Muslims, the Russian Muslims near Kazakhstan, they're breeding like rabbits. And their birth rate is actually much, much higher than the Russians. Can you blame the Russians for not having high birth rates? Only having one, maybe two children? Look at the situation there. And the number of Muslims inside Russia has been growing. And Putin is obsessed. He gives talks about what he calls, quote unquote, the Russian gene. Says the Russian gene is special and endangered. And he likes to come back to the Russian gene as being threatened. And that's maybe why he keeps drawing on Chechnya and Siberia for these 300,000 troops instead of Moscow and St. Petersburg. My question is, 300,000 poorly trained, poorly armed Russian soldiers from Chechnya or Siberia fighting against Ukrainians who are fighting for their lives, their existential war to preserve their country. Those 300,000 are just there as a human buffer to try and push the Ukrainians back. And yes, he's sending those 300,000 Russians to the morgue. We continue to see over and over that Putin is speaking in terms that are almost impossible to decipher from what he used to be. Putin used to be a very cold, calculating, logical, former KGB agent who spoke about Russia's influence, Russia's territory, Russia's national interests, and he always kept Europe and the United States from getting too close because the Europeans relied and depended upon him for oil and for gas. And now he's done almost the impossible. he's brought NATO and the United States closer together than they've been in the last 30 years. And he was delighted a few years ago when Donald Trump went to NATO meetings and criticized the German and French and Italian and British leaders, saying, you people don't pay enough of your dues. And it seemed like the United States was angrier at our NATO allies than we were with the Russians or with those countries like North Korea that really seemed to threaten our interests. But today, it's a different story. Putin has brought us closer together. And what's astounding is when you start seeing stories of Germany giving air defenses to the Ukrainians, and Ukraine specifically asking Israel for the Iron Dome defense. Folks, Israel and the United States developed the Iron Dome, which protects Israel from Hezbollah launching rockets from either Lebanon or Syria into Israel. The Iron Dome is a remarkable defense system. It basically shoots out of the sky these missiles before they can land. And Ukraine has asked for help with the missiles that are coming down right now, hitting Ukrainian cities. And Israel has said, well, we'd like to be neutral. But if Iranian drones continue to be made and used, and if Iran continues to be a bigger and bigger partner of Russia, how long will it be before the United States starts to ask Israel to perhaps help out Ukraine, even if they do it covertly? You pick up a New York Times and you see a headline, Russia reactivates its trolls and bots ahead of Tuesday's midterms. Putin declares martial law, rains bombs on Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's nightmare that he will turn out to be just like Gaddafi in Libya, overturned by his own people and beaten to death by angry mobs. Senior Russian military leaders reportedly discuss using tactical nuclear weapons. And then, will Israel remain neutral? Question mark. Vladimir Putin has turned this into a nightmare for Russia, an economic, political, and military nightmare. And yet, he does not want to be seen as weak. He will not admit that his country has simply not been able to win on the ground. He should declare victory, tell Ukraine that of those 4 states that he took, the Russian people inside 2 of them require Russia to hold on to parts of 2, and the rest can go back to Ukraine and end this now. But that is not likely to happen. Instead, Putin threatens to cut off the grain coming from Ukraine, folks. Now, last week, they agreed. Turkey was the intermediary who said, Russia, Ukraine, we need both of you to please allow each other to ship your grain out. Because if that is not allowed to happen, the price of grain is going to go up all over the world, and the supply is going to go way down. And we've seen what happened when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and all of the oil companies were able to take advantage of a rising price of oil. And suddenly, even though we got 3% of our imported oil from Russia, but the fact that oil was suddenly going to be scarce makes the price go up so much. By the way, little known story came out. Few people heard this last week. British Petroleum, BP, announced their quarterly profits. You ready? A year ago, it was $32 billion for the third quarter of 2021. How much is it for the third quarter now in 2022? $74 billion for the third quarter. $74 billion. BP and all the other oil companies in the US have seen this as a wonderful opportunity. There's no reason, folks. We have no shortage of gas or oil in the United States. And what would have happened to the cost of bread if the Russians would have said, no, we're not letting the ships with the Ukrainian grain go out? What if the Russians would have said, we're not going to allow that grain to be sold? Well, they would have been kicking themselves because they're also selling grain to a lot of countries that desperately need it in Africa, in the Middle East. It's amazing how these strange things happening far away are affecting all of us here in Mount Lebanon. The price of gas, the price of bread, the anger of Americans going to the voting booths tomorrow for the midterm elections. It makes you wonder almost, doesn't it? If certain leaders, I don't know, say the Prince of Saudi Arabia, really wants to see Republicans, not Democrats, in Washington, D.C. It's interesting, though. Why would the Saudis announce that they're not going to increase production? They're actually going to lower production. So the price goes up. And then the Saudis say to us, it's strictly business. Well, you know what we should say to the Saudis? We're not going to sell you one more bullet or tank or plane to defend yourselves against a hostile Iran. It's not personal, it's strictly business. What a great ally Saudi Arabia is, aren't they? Raising the price of oil and gas, deciding to pump less so that the price can go up just in time for the midterm elections. Coincidence? Amazing, amazing. Well, folks, I often speak on these very, very serious topics that have a lot of repercussions on us here at home. And audiences always say to me, George, why do you always speak about these fascinating, but really somewhat terrifying topics? And they're so incredibly just worrisome for us. And I say, I always come with a little levity at the end. I always do. And I told Rabbi Alex when I spoke at the first Monday in August that I'd have a little fun at his expense. And he was fine with it. He said, that's great. We'll never invite you again, but don't worry. That'll be fine. Alex and I are very dear friends. He's a rock star and one of my favorite people. And so I'm going to leave with a few, and then we'll open up for questions. A few quick vignettes, okay? So an old man goes to a Catholic church and decides to make confession. He goes into the confessional and he says to the priest, Father, I'm 75 years old. I've been married for 50 years. All these years I've been faithful to my wife, but yesterday, I was intimate with a 21-year-old blonde woman. And the priest says, okay, well, let's start with, when was the last time you made confession? And the man says, what? Never. I've never made confession. I'm Jewish. And the priest says, wait a minute, if you're Jewish, why are you telling me this? And he says, what, are you kidding? I'm 75. I slept with a 21-year-old. I'm telling everybody. There was a priest, a Presbyterian minister, and a rabbi who were having a wonderful discussion about who was best at their job. So they each went into the woods on a camping trip, and the goal was to find a bear and attempt to convert it. So after they went out and did this, they finally got together, and the Catholic priest started. He said, when I found the bear, I read to him from the catechism. I sprinkled him with holy water, and next week is his first communion. Well, the minister said, oh, okay, fine. I found the bear by the stream, and I preached God's holy word. The bear was so mesmerized that he let me baptize him right there. So now they both look down at the rabbi, who is lying on a gurney in a body cast, a full body cast. And the rabbi says, looking back, maybe I shouldn't have started with the circumcision. And this is dedicated to my friend Rabbi Alex. There was a rabbi who fell in the ocean and he couldn't swim. So when a boat came by, the captain yelled, "Do you need help, sir?" And the rabbi calmly said, "No, God will save me." A few minutes later, another small boat comes by. The fisherman says, "Hey, sir, do you need help?" And once again, the rabbi replied, "No, God will save me." Well, eventually the rabbi drowned. He went to heaven and he asked God, "Why? Why didn't you save me?" And God said, "You're an idiot. I sent you 2 boats. What did you do?" And my last one has nothing to do with spirituality or faith. It's about a local United Way office that realized it had never received a donation from the town's most successful entrepreneur, CEO who made $60 million a year. So the head of the United Way said, "Why don't we ever call this guy and ask him why he has never donated a cent to our United Way Community Fund?" So he calls him. And he says, "Look, sir, I'm not trying to give you any grief. It's just that our research has shown you make more than 60 million a year and you've never given a penny to the United Way. Wouldn't you like to give back to your community in some small way?" And the fellow thought this over for a moment. He replied, "Well, first, did your research show that my mother is dying after a long battle with cancer and has medical bills that are several times her income?" Well, embarrassed, the United Way person says, "I'm sorry, I didn't know that." So second, my brother is a disabled Gulf War veteran who is blind and confined to a wheelchair. Well, the United Way representative starts to apologize, but he's put off. Third, sir, my sister's husband died in a traffic accident, leaving her penniless with 4 children. The humiliated United Way president simply tries to say, "I'm sorry, I had no idea." And once again, he gets cut off by the CEO who says, "And I didn't give any money to any of them, so why should I give anything to you?" Why? Tomorrow is our midterm elections. It will be fascinating to see all of these close elections that may not be decided by tomorrow night, that may require days and days of waiting for absentee ballots, overseas ballots, military ballots to come in. It'll be fascinating to see when we will actually learn who's won some of these elections. And it'll be fascinating when everything is said and done to see just how many of the trolls and bots from Russia that were trying to send these fake social media ads and stories actually succeeded. It's a pleasure to speak here each year. I enjoy it very much, and I thank you all for having me. Thank you so much. And I'd be happy to answer questions either from the Zoom people or from my friends who are live and in attendance. Sir, let's start with you. Can you repeat that one more time, sir? Can you repeat that?
I said Iran, I know is not friends of the United States. But what is the reason for participating with Russia, selling those drones what, what's their game? Besides maybe economic.
It is economic. They are making a very nice profit from this. Second, they don't have too many allies around the world. And this is a partnership Iran believes down the road can pay off for them. Because in the Middle East, you had the Russians who helped Assad in Syria. And the Iranians are worried they might need Russian help down the road to keep the Ayatollahs in power. If all of a sudden you start seeing uprisings, as you're seeing now in Iran, with the protests in the streets against the terrible government and terrible economy inside Iran. I don't think it makes sense for them, and I agree with you. For the economic benefit, the money they're going to make from selling these, for the alliance they're going to have with Russia, they'd be much better off getting closer to China and staying away from the Russians. But that's not how they operate.
You anticipate happening if, God forbid, Republicans get to take over the Senate?
Question was, what happens if tomorrow there's a Republican victory in the House and the Senate? I honestly believe that 2 years later, there will be a Democratic victory, because every time we see midterm elections, it's usually the party that lost in the presidential election that gets victories and gains seats. And then what happens is 2 years later, they lose seats. Now, I think what's going to be fascinating is to see those key 5 states, which right now are absolutely 50-50. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, Arizona. I mean, it's incredible. And you can't trust polls, and I don't anymore, because polls do not have the validity they once did. People don't want to answer. I've spoken. My mother-in-law, of all people, said she was contacted and she lied and said she was Republican and gave false answers. I said, why did you do that? She goes, I don't want them to know how I really think or vote. And I don't think that she's the exception or the very, very rare, person. I don't trust the polls. I don't think people answer to them anymore. What do I think would happen if you saw a Republican majority in the House and the Senate? I think it would be, again, which Republicans rise to the prominence? Are we going to see McConnell rise up? Are we going to see the Marjorie Taylor Greens have a more powerful role? And honestly, that would be a death wish for the Republicans if they put up a Marjorie Taylor Greene in a powerful position where she is speaking on issues and she's out in front as one of the leaders in the House. Hey, let's not forget, Donald Trump lost not only the presidency in 2020, he lost the House and the Senate. That's hard. And you've got people like former House Speaker, Republican Paul Ryan, who's been saying, I don't want any part of Trump in 2024 because he's going to bring down the Republican Party, because people who are moderate or sane, Democrats and Republicans and independents, are going to look at this guy and go, what? I mean, this is ridiculous. And for Liz Cheney to send out, and she's very conservative, but she staked her reputation, lost her career based on the fact that she wasn't going to allow the crazies on January 6th to try and overturn our democracy. I mean, this is almost beyond belief. Can you imagine when we were in college, if somebody would have said, hey, guess what? In 2021, they're going to raid the Capitol. They're going to smash the windows. They're going to break in. They're going to be looking for the vice president and the Speaker of the House to kill them. They're going to have Confederate flags. They're going to be, this is not going to be a scene from some third world country. This is going to be Washington, D.C., and they're going to be egged on by the reality show person who won the presidential election, but won't admit to losing when he ran for re-election, and so is going to bring out all the insane lunatic fringe to invade Washington, D.C. And then you would have said, hey, that's a really great idea. What are you making, a zombie monster thriller movie for some kind of project? can this possibly even be real? There are times when you just have to look and say, this can't be. I mean, let's face it, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, we've always had, the back and forth. But goodness knows in Pennsylvania, we had John Hines as a senator. We had Dick Thornburg as a governor. We had people who were either conservative or liberal, but you could listen and have a discussion. I mean, look at who's running. Herschel Walker in Georgia. What? If Herschel can utter a sentence, I'm impressed. He's lowered the bar so much for me. When he starts to speak, I think, what's going to come out of his mouth? And I'm sorry, regardless of who you like in these states, these aren't like elected leaders, people who went from, mayor, city council, representative, governor, running for Senate, running for representative. Oh my. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see. But elections have consequences, and we shall see if it becomes something that galvanizes the Democrats, because I think if it happened, you would see the Democrats finally say, boy, we need to turn out more for elections. And, in 2 years, there's going to be an election for president. So again, we shall see. Sir, in the back.
You talked at length about where the war in Ukraine has been and where it is. Any thoughts about realistically where it's going?
Great question. How about possible scenarios for where it's going? Okay. Sure. Question was, you've analyzed what has happened in Ukraine, what is currently going on. What about possible scenarios in the future? What could happen? I think there's three. The first one is the Russians decide to up the ante and start sending more missiles and attacking more civilians and towns and villages in Ukraine. And they start to go bigger and dirtier. They start to cut off the grain. They start to basically decide we've got nothing to lose. And so Putin goes he doubles down even more. The other scenario is inside Russia, it gets increasingly worse economically. There's more protests, more anger, and either Putin wakes up and says, this is going to lead to my downfall, or his people around him say, you have to stop. That's the second scenario. The third scenario is this drags out into a war of attrition that Putin believes he can still win. And so it drags out over the winter into spring. But the thing is, if this drags out, it becomes less and less popular in Russia, and it becomes worse and worse for their economy. So Putin might think that that's something he can pull off, hoping that NATO and the US, that alliance fractures. That's his hope. But if it doesn't come apart this winter, it's never going to come apart as long as he's in Ukraine doing what he's doing. Everything he's done has backfired. Every move he's made has been a failure. Even the generals who used to have yachts, and the Russians are like, wait a minute, where does a Russian general get the money to buy a yacht? Where does Putin get the money to have a yacht the size of a football field and a beautiful mansion that they're saying cost maybe $1 billion? Do you think maybe they're skimming a little off the top in Russia? Interesting. Great question. Neil.
Did the CIA help remove a democratically elected pro-Russia president of Ukraine prior to the current administration? So I guess the CIA.
I don't think we're that good. I don't think we are that good. I honestly think that the protests that were happening in the streets in Russia were because the Ukrainians didn't want to move closer to Moscow. They wanted to stay either kind of independent or be closer to the Europeans, especially in the European Union, the EU. And what happened was this guy started to declare martial law whenever there were protests and was trying to clamp down with help from Putin, and the people weren't having it. And suddenly he decided, I'm not going to make this fight happen. They might get me and take me out. So he fled to Moscow. And that's when Putin started to blame us, blame the CIA, blame the US Secretary of State for somehow having the power to pull this off. And my only response to that is, I wish we had the power to do stuff like that. The only time we've gone into a country has been a disaster, like Iraq, where we took out Saddam Hussein and civil war and chaos follow. Where we've gone in has usually been a disaster. Even Libya, when we were, along with the European countries, helping to get rid of Gaddafi. And again, civil war and chaos breaks out. So I don't think that we have our thumbprint on, we change things in Ukraine. I don't buy it. Sir.
Yes. So early on tonight, you said that the money given to Ukraine has been a bipartisan effort, and Mitch McConnell has said it's a weapon. My concern, again, getting back to what my wife said about the Republicans, if Ron Johnson wins and Marjorie Taylor Greene gets power, there are so many Republicans on that side that would cut off funding. And I don't think McConnell has the strength to stop them.
Yeah, that's a great point. It'll be a definite battle within the Republic. I'm sorry, I'll repeat it. Yes. The question was if Republicans are able to win key seats and the Marjorie Taylor Greene element of the party that wants to cut off any kind of U.S. support for Ukraine wins. Will Mitch McConnell be able to kind of rein them in? The question becomes then within the Republican Party, do you see the Mitch McConnells? Do you see the element of the Republican Party that doesn't see Vladimir Putin and the Russians as somebody we want to help being out in front? Which of those two sides within the Republicans is able to really win that battle? I don't know. Up until now, Biden has gotten support. Just a few days ago, two senators, one Republican, one Democrat, went to Kiev to meet with Zelensky and tell him, don't worry. What happens in the midterm elections is our internal stuff. It's not going to affect you. Biden is going to continue to support you. Mitch McConnell is going to continue to support you. We have enough support. So we'll see. It will be fascinating. Let me go here and then I'll go back to you, Neil. So, sir.
Talk about the bots and all this stuff. What are we doing to prevent that or to stop them on the way in? I know we have the CIA and the NSA and all that looking at it, but where do we go to prevent some of that stuff? I know we're a free country, so there's a question of where we can stand there. But to me, if we know something like that is coming, this went back into 2016, 2020. So this is not anything new.
Absolutely.
But I'm just wondering how we can kind of tone it down and try to prevent it.
I think we've done a much better job since 2016. We didn't hear too much in 2020 about the Russian success with fake ads and stuff on Facebook. And I think it's been a public-private partnership where the people at the NSA and the people in intelligence basically got together with the leaders of social media companies and said, look, you're basically aiding and abetting Russian intelligence, cyber criminals from doing these things. And as long as you allow them to freely operate with no filter, with no problem, with no kind of restriction, this is going to increase. And so, believe it or not, in Estonia a few years ago, they figured out how to plug the holes that the Russians were getting through into computers in Estonia. And quietly, the Americans called the Estonians in and said, show us. And so our people, we've got some very smart people at CMU who quietly have been working on this now for a few years. And we've got these people in the US and in Europe who are all saying, look, the Russians aren't just going to try and tamper with American elections. They would love to play around with the French elections, the German, the Italian. They would love for the far right candidates to take over those countries because those far right candidates are much more sympathetic to Putin than the other candidates in these countries. So I think there's been a lot of combined effort between the Europeans, the United States, Interpol, universities like CMU and MIT, basically figuring out where the Russians were coming from. And one thing that happened when Putin invaded Ukraine is he didn't have the money or the resources to keep this kind of cyber attack constantly going on against us. You know, he had to pull out of Syria. He also had to pull out of these cyber attacks because he didn't have the money and the people to do it the way he did before he embarked on this horrific war. So I think quietly we are seeing us defend pretty well. You're also seeing American companies. We haven't heard too many stories about American companies getting hacked, right, for ransomware, because that was a huge story. I spoke on this a couple of years ago. American companies that would just pay out the ransom so that they weren't crippled with their computer systems. Well, guess what? A lot of smart Americans are making money defending American companies from getting attacked. And I think it's really shown thus far, sir, that quietly we've been at the last 2 to 3 years learned from our unbelievable mistakes. And maybe it also has something to do with the intelligence agencies and the executive branch being on the same page, seeing Russia as a threat, instead of the intelligence people going to the Oval Office and saying, look at what they're doing, and the president saying, come on, they can't be doing that. That's Putin and my friend. He's not doing any of those things. Please, please. Oh, we're going to have a couple more. Come on, we're having fun. Neil. Go ahead, please, please.
Will Ukraine, do you think Ukraine would be made a member of NATO? Can you repeat the question?
Great question. Will Ukraine become a member of NATO? I would have said absolutely not up until a few weeks ago. NATO didn't want Ukraine. The US didn't want Ukraine in NATO. The Germans, the French, the British didn't want Ukraine in NATO. Nobody wanted Ukraine in NATO. That's what was so stupid about Putin doing this. They were never going to join NATO because NATO understands that rule number one, an attack on one is an attack on all. And nobody wanted to go to war with Russia. But now, and I'll tell you this, if the Russians use a dirty bomb or any kind of nuclear weapon, tomorrow, Ukraine will be in NATO. So if Putin makes that mistake, tomorrow they'll be in NATO. Other than that, NATO wanted no part of Ukraine. The European Union has already fast-tracked them into membership in the EU. So Ukraine will be receiving a lot of money. Keep this in mind. Who's going to rebuild Ukraine, folks? If Vladimir Putin turns them to dust, who's going to rebuild Ukraine? You had a question. Great question. I'll repeat it. How did Putin miscalculate so badly that he thought the US and the European countries would do nothing? He was going off of 2014 when he invaded Crimea. We did nothing. This was much different, though. This was him attempting to invade and take over the whole country. And remember that right before he invaded, the French president, Macron, paid him a visit. Then the German Chancellor Scholz paid him a visit. And both of them said, listen, we don't want this. We don't want to see you invade Ukraine. We don't want a war. This is going to cause a lot of problems. It's going to make oil prices go up. Our economies, our countries are going to get hurt. the French president, the German chancellor, they both went to Moscow and they told him, Vladimir, don't do this. If you're looking for a little extra territory on the border, negotiate and you'll get it. But don't do this. And Putin spit in their face. And when he did that, he basically told the Europeans, I don't care what you think. And he told Joe Biden and the Americans, you are dumb and useless, and I don't worry about you at all. After Afghanistan and the debacle, the way you left Afghanistan, you're not going to do anything and help the Ukrainians. What a blunder and idiotic move. He also thought the Russian army was powerful, strong, would go through Ukraine in weeks. Boy, did he overestimate the Russian might. So I think he was shocked, and I think he was going by his old, what happened in 2014. And I don't think he believed Biden and the Europeans saying, we're not going to let it happen this time. We've drawn a line. Yes, sir.
China is taking any message from all this with regards to Hong Kong.
Well, not Hong Kong, but Taiwan.
Taiwan.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, the question was, what about China? Are they taking any lessons from this vis-a-vis Taiwan? And I'm going to say yes. They're absolutely watching this to see, first of all, can the alliance stay together? Because if China were to go into Taiwan, the United States would try a similar alliance with Japan, South Korea, Australia. And the question is, would that be a deterrent to China? Would Japan and South Korea and Australia and the United States be able to kind of thwart China doing that? And maybe Xi is looking at this saying, maybe we just wait them out. One school of thought is Xi waits 5-6 years for things to calm down around the world. And then he puts more pressure on Taiwan. He does something. Another school of thought is while the world is watching Ukraine and Russia, maybe now is the time for him to put pressure on. I think Xi is very calculating. And he knows that in the United States, things can change. And he also looks at the world today and he sees this alliance in Europe and the United States, and maybe an alliance in Asia that might not be able to last more than another year, 2 or 3. He's got time. I mean, he has been loud and bellicose and saying Taiwan belongs to us and we will not. And he's been very provocative, flying planes over Taiwan, getting closer and closer to them, in the South China Sea. But whether or not he actually tries to pull that off, I think he's seen some very interesting things happen with what the Russians tried in Ukraine. And I think he's going to be more careful, not make the same mistakes Putin made. Well, folks, one last question. This will be our last question. Please.
Interesting. I certainly agree that Russia is power grabbing evil. But I wonder how much of this we can blame on Russia when the American people show up like 20-25% to vote. When we don't get personally involved in a war that could be World War III. The average American, this war is not touching their lives. They aren't interested. They're in their SUV, taking the kids to school, going to soccer, and yeah, it's on the news again, turn it off. I have things to do. 20 people, this is a very intense subject. And you're here to discuss it, and we're very interested. But we're certainly even less than a minority. We're a drop in a bucket. That's what's scary to me, that we're not involved at all as a nation. We're not together. When Roosevelt asked for help, people were getting baby buggy wheels, putting them at the curb, getting out of. Nobody's doing anything. What are we getting? Potholders, bandages for soldiers? It's not happening. So how can we get America involved without having the Democrats and Republicans killing each other just to get reelected? And nothing happens to us.
Well, first of all, I want to be your campaign manager. Because I think you've got a career ahead of you. No, I think you're making some very important and salient points, really. But keep in mind, the United States has been leading in the amount of money and aid we've given to Ukraine. The leaders, Biden and Congress, have been giving a lot of economic aid, military aid, support. Just from our spy planes, where the Russians are, where the Ukrainians should hit them, where the Russians are trying to keep their weapons. I mean, we've been out in front helping Ukraine, and Zelensky knows that. You're right. It has not been a sexy topic as far as like on the news every night and Americans wanting to donate, but it's been our leaders who have seen, and the leaders throughout Europe that have seen how important it is. Now, I'm going to say that it hasn't hit us with, okay, we're going to have shortages of gas and oil this winter. We're not, but it's going to hit a lot of our allies in Europe. And we're going to see maybe prices continue to stay high, our gas prices. Who knows with grain, what's going to happen? Will bread prices suddenly go up? And here's something crazy. I'll leave you with this. I like sunflower oil. I know it's ridiculous. I'm Italian. I should only use olive oil, right? What's wrong with me? But I got turned on to sunflower oil a few years ago and I loved it. You can't get it on the shelves anymore because Ukraine was one of the biggest producers of sunflower oil, and now forget it. But you're right. People need to understand that this does have an impact. And people in Israel are wondering, is Israel going to be drawn in? What is Iran doing here? What's going to happen across the whole globe if suddenly grain becomes, oh my God, in short supply? Well, remember my credo, folks. I sleep like a baby. And I hope all the rest of you do too. Thank you all very much. Neil, is there anything we need to say to the nice people at home? Come join us. 3 wine and cheese at Neil's house next time. All right. Thanks so much. My pleasure.
But you'll be able to with my email it to me, that's all.
I'm just thinking I'm exhausted. Thanks, I appreciate it. My pleasure. Thank you. It's okay.